Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 3:30, so let's bring the meeting back to order. We have one more topic for discussion today, which is Black Sea Bass 2022 and 2023 specifications. As Chairman Nowalski noted, we will not need to do a board-only action on the FMP review, so we're just going to deal with specifications at this point. Julia, with council staff, is going to provide us the presentation along with Dr. Rago, and we'll go from there. So, Julia, I see your presentation up on the screen. Are you ready to go?
Ready.
Okay. I can hear you loud and clear, so whenever you're ready, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. I have a similar presentation as for the other species earlier today. I'm going to review the management track assessment results for black sea bass, touch on high-level recent fishery performance, summarize what the advisors had to say about black sea bass in their fishery performance report, and then Dr. Rago will take it over again for the SSC recommendations, and then I'll summarize the monitoring committee recommendations and additional AP input that was provided after the monitoring committee input. And then I added a slide at the end that's specific to ACL evaluation that wasn't explicitly part of the briefing materials that you've seen so far. And the objective of today's discussion is for the council and board to recommend catch and landings limits for 2022 and 2023. And then if you so desire, any recommended changes to the commercial management measures and the February recreational opening for 2022. First I'll summarize the kind of key points from the management track assessment that was completed this summer. So this assessment only added one additional year of data compared to the last assessment that we got before that. And it didn't really change much about our understanding of the stock. So the stock is still in really good shape. It was not overfished in 2019. In fact, biomass was slightly more than double the target level, and overfishing was not occurring in 2019, and the fishing mortality rate was about 15% below the threshold level that defines an overfished condition. So these next two slides show figures from the stock assessment that basically shows that same information that I just said, but in graph form. So this figure shows the time series of spawning stock biomass estimated through the stock assessment in red. And you can see that biomass reached a peak in 2014, and it's been declining since that time. And with black sea bass, it's important to remember that the stock assessment has a retrospective pattern that's big enough that it requires an adjustment, and that adjustment is only made in the terminal year. So for this slide, there's spawning stock biomass and also recruitment, and on the next slide, it'll show the fishing mortality rate, and those have all been adjusted for 2019 only to account for this retrospective pattern and the adjustment that was made. So the horizontal dashed line here is the biomass target level, and so when you look at that red line, that is showing, you know, what the assessment is predicting for the trend in biomass, and it is declining. And but it's important to note that only the terminal year is adjusted, and that adjustment scales the estimate up. So the red line can give you an idea of the overall trend, but the scale, you should really look at that red circle. So when comparing that red circle to the horizontal line, that's where we get that, you know, statement of it's 210% of the target level. It's a little bit more than double the target level. So I just wanted to make that really clear, because if you look just at the line, it looks like it's a lot closer to the target level than it really is because of that adjustment that's applied. And so recruitment is shown here as well in the bars, and the adjusted value is in the black square. Again, that's only for the terminal year. So recruitment is shown here as age 1 fish. So you can see the 2011 year class was the biggest in the time series, and it's showing up here as age 1 in 2012. So we had a big 2011 year class. There's also a big 2015 year class that's showing up in 2016. And the most recent 3 years of recruitment estimates are showing some mixed signals. So the 2017 year class showing up here in 2018 at age 1 was below average, but then the 2018 year class showing up here as age 1 in 2019 was above average. But we haven't had any, in the most recent 3 years, no additional like year classes that are well above average like the 2015 and 2011 year classes were. So this slide shows fishing mortality in the black squares. And again, there's a retrospective adjustment applied here. So the red square is that adjusted value, and that's what we compare to the threshold level, which is the horizontal line. So we want to stay below that level because when we're below that level, that means that overfishing is not occurring, and you can see that that's where we're at with the stock, so that is good news. So that's all I had for just the super high level assessment results. And next I'll move into some high level fishery performance updates. So this slide summarizes commercial and recreational landings through 2020 and dead discards through 2019. And black sea bass has the same 2020 COVID-related data gaps as were described for the other species earlier today. The biggest impacts were on the commercial discard estimates due to the suspension of the observer program for part of the year last year, and impacts on the recreational catch estimates. Again, there's imputed data factoring into 2020 recreational landings. But just in terms of some big picture trends shown here, you can see that both commercial and recreational landings increased each year from 2018 through 2020. Commercial landings totaled about 4.21 million pounds in 2020, which was the highest level of commercial landings since the start of the Joint Management Program in 1998. In 2020, recreational landings totaled 9.05 million pounds, which is the highest level since 2016 and 2017, which were years with recreational harvest estimates that have been identified as outliers by the monitoring committee. I'm also having this thunderstorm, so hopefully my internet holds strong, but I can join back by phone if needed, but I will plow ahead. Okay, so this slide shows commercial and recreational landings compared to their landings limits over the past few years. And starting with the commercial side of things, you can see that the commercial fishery has generally, this is true throughout the time series of having a coastwide commercial quota, that the commercial landings are generally very close to their quota. The exception is 2020, where we had a 25% underage. And you can also see here that the 2020 commercial quota is the highest shown on the screen here. It was also the highest that had ever been implemented to date at that time. And this is also, obviously 2020 had some major impacts from COVID. Based on a lot of what we heard from advisors this year and last year, we think that that 25% underage has probably more to do with COVID than it has to do with the big increase from one year going into the next. That, you know, like I previously said, the fishery typically lands very close to their quota. Black sea bass is a very valuable, you know, high demand species. So we think that's evidence of COVID impacts happening in 2020. On the recreational side of things, we do have that situation where we have to compare RHLs through 2019 to the old MRIP data, and then from 2020 forward, we can compare them with the new MRIP data. So that's what that comparison is on the screen here. And you can see that there's some years of notable overages, some years with minor underages. I did want to call out that 2020 overage specifically. So you can see on the slide here that based on the 2020 MRIP data, which again includes some amount of imputed data, that there was a 56% RHL overage. And I want to remind everybody that the council and board chose to leave the recreational bag size and season limits unchanged in 2020, despite an expectation that this would result in an RHL overage. And the reason for that was, you know, by this point in time, we had catch and landings limits that were based on a stock assessment that incorporated the new MRIP data. And the new MRIP data really changed our understanding of catch in the recreational fishery, such that it's a lot higher than what we previously thought. So in many ways, management is now using the new MRIP data, but of course, we still have this separate ongoing action to consider if the commercial and recreational allocations should change partially in response to the new MRIP data, because the commercial and recreational allocations did not change. We also have this ongoing recreational reform initiative. So there's multiple actions that the council and board are considering about if changes are needed to some important aspects of fisheries management in the future. And because these actions are still ongoing and were still ongoing at the time when the council and board were considering the 2020 recreational bag size and season limits, there was a decision to leave those bag size and season limits unchanged and not implement the major restrictions that would have been necessary to constrain the fishery to the RHL in 2020. So long story short is that we did have a notable RHL overage in 2020, and we expected that to occur based on management decisions. This figure shows the current fishing year, 2021, for the commercial fishery, and it's showing the landings trajectory. So if the landings are evenly spaced throughout the year, they would follow that green line to meet the quota by the end of the year. The yellow line shows last year's landings trajectory, and the blue line shows this year's landings trajectory. You can see that they're on a somewhat similar path until about late March, and then this year's landings are outpacing last year's landings. And we think that has a lot to do with COVID impacts because the major restrictions went into place around late March last year, and that had impacts on the fisheries, and maybe we're seeing some amount of recovery from that in the landings this year. And this is based on data reported through August 4th, and that shows that 46% of the commercial quota has been landed based on that data so far. For the recreational fishery, we don't have any useful preliminary information to show you so far about the current year in terms of MRIP data, because so far what's available for the current year is only preliminary information through April, and this doesn't really provide us meaningful information about the current year because for black sea bass, most states are closed through at least May 15th. So next, moving on to what advisors had to say when they wrote the fishery performance report. I'm not going to repeat comments that Carson already summarized that applied to all three species, but just wanted to remind you that she summarized them in earlier presentations, and they also apply here. But focusing on things that advisors had to say that were specific to black sea bass, they talked about some COVID-19 impacts on the black sea bass fishery specifically. So one advisor said that the restrictions on restaurants due to COVID-19 caused a significant drop in the price of black sea bass in 2020, and that the price has not fully recovered yet. One advisor said that the restaurant market for fresh fish is very important in some areas, and it has not yet fully recovered, so that's continuing to have some impacts on the commercial fishery. And a few advisors talked about different impacts on the for-hire sector depending on the state that they lived in. So one advisor who's a for-hire captain out of Virginia said that he saw high demand for near-shore trips off of Virginia Beach and Oregon Inlet last year, and he attributed this to the stimulus payments. So some people had extra money in their pockets, and some people used that money to go fishing. And he said that his understanding was that the for-hire trips in his area generally were fully booked. Sometimes they were operating under restricted capacity to different degrees, but whatever the restriction was, they did generally were able to book their trips. And he wasn't aware of any for-hire vessels having trouble finding crew or retaining crew in the Virginia area, which is different than what advisors said about some other states that Carson previously summarized. Another advisor said that it was a different story in New York, and it was his understanding that during 2020 there was almost no charter trips out of New York until the fall when things began to pick up a little bit, but he felt that the charter industry there was much more impacted by COVID restrictions and concerns about social distancing. Advisors had a few different things to say about recreational fishery. So it was noted during the advisory panel meeting that although we don't have discard estimates and weight for the recreational fishery in 2020 at this point in time, there was a recreational ACL overage in 2020 based on landings alone. And because of the way the regulations are and due to stock status, this will not require a pound per pound payback because of the good stock status for black sea bass. One advisor said this is a fairness issue because the commercial fishery must always pay back their quota overages regardless of stock status. One advisor, this may have been a few advisors, had some concerns related to different aspects of compliance in the recreational fishery. So one advisor expressed concern about anglers fishing from private docks exceeding the bag limit, and there was also a concern raised about some anglers, recreational anglers, maybe selling their catch. One advisor said that if we had better information on the number of anglers, that would help us improve the MRIP data, and the MRIP data estimates number of trips, not number of anglers. One advisor talked about the recreational opening in February in Virginia. He said that this year in 2021, there was a lot of bad weather in February, but when vessels were able to go out, they caught a lot of black sea bass. And he thought this has been a very beneficial thing for Virginia, and he wished there could be a longer winter opening. So, for example, allowing the recreational fishery to be open in January in addition to February. One advisor had some concerns related to biological and ecological issues. So he was concerned that the trawl surveys don't sufficiently sample the offshore habitat of black sea bass. So he was worried that spawning stock biomass in the assessment was underestimated as a result. He also expressed concerns about the impacts of the very abundant black sea bass population on shellfish species, including important fishery species such as lobster. And he said that we need emergency liberalizations in the commercial and recreational black sea bass fisheries to take more black sea bass out of the ecosystem to help mitigate some of these negative impacts on shellfish. And advisors had a lot of research recommendations that kind of centered around activities that are occurring mostly due to offshore wind energy development, but some of the things listed here are for oil and gas exploration. So advisors wanted to better understand the impacts of electromagnetic fields, pile driving, seismic testing, and sub-bottom profiling on black sea bass and other fishery species. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rako to give the SSC report.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Appreciate the very comprehensive overview of the stock resource. There are a couple of points here that I think are important to emphasize. First of all, black sea bass are modeled as two spatial units, and that reflects differences between the north and the south areas, with respect to Hudson Canyon. And what is done is that the overall stock status is determined by combining the results of each of these spatial units. And we don't have any explicit migration between the two, but they are partitioned with respect to the most recent information about stock distribution and status. The consequence of this is that you have an overall retrospective pattern that is quite different than we see in most species, and there's kind of a reciprocal relationship between the northern and the southern areas. In the north, the stock is consistently overestimated, which is underestimated, which is consistent with the observation of the AP member that Julia just cited, and also it's overestimated in the south. But the net effect of that is an over estimation of fishing mortality and an underestimation of spawning stock biomass. So that's in contrast to most of them, where we overestimate stock biomass and underestimate the fishing mortality. That is what is shown in those graphs that Julia had with respect to not only spawning stock biomass and recruitment, but also with respect to fishing mortality rates. The current stock size is 210% of the BMSY level, and that's largely a result of those two strong year classes, the largest ever 2011 and the 2015 year classes. As those year classes mature and die, there is an expectation that that resource will, the stock SSB will decline over time. And we'll see the consequences of that in a moment here. The SSC did discuss the underlying basis for estimation of fishing mortality rates between areas, and we didn't have an explicit recommendation at this time, but look forward to the research track assessment in 2022 as a way of addressing this. So that's going to be in November. And then finally, in terms of general comments, we expressed appreciation for the dedicated service and extraordinary work of Gary Shepard, and who has been the lead on this stock for many years and is now retiring. So wish him the best. Next slide, please. We then entered into our term of reference mode there in terms of deciding on an appropriate ABC. The overfishing limit set using a fishing mortality of 0.46, and we used an overall CV of 100%. One of the reasons for that is that we do have this growing problem of retrospective bias between the North and the South, and as a result, it did require a correction to allow for that, or to accommodate that pattern of overestimation of F and underestimation of spawning stock biomass. There, of course, is a large recreational component, which is a result in part of the increase in the perceived amounts taken through the MRIP estimation process. But we did notice that there are consistent patterns in fishery independent indices and so forth. I'll just return to a recurring theme here for today, that we could not use the averaged ABC approach because this resulted in a P-star value greater than 0.5 in 2023. So we're using the unadulterated, time varying P-star approach for the recommendations that will be forthcoming. Next slide, please. There are, sources of uncertainty and research recommendations, and so these are listed here. I've mentioned the retrospective pattern is an issue. There may be sex-related differences with respect to natural mortality rates. When the black sea bass are a protogynous hermaphrodite, they switch from males to from females to males at about 5 or 6 years old. It's so there is a difference in the spatial distribution of productivity, with apparently greater productivity now in northern areas. There are concerns about this both the temporal pattern and the spatial distribution of recreational catches as they change. We don't really know a whole lot about movements per se between these two spatial areas, north and south, and they're not parameterized in the model, so there's no estimate of the flux between north and south and vice versa. And then, of course, the gift that keeps on giving, the impacts of COVID-related data collection in 2020. In terms of research recommendations, there was some expression that we probably should revisit the methods for calculating fishing mortality and reference points when you have assessments over 2 spatial units, 2 or more. We want further work on the implications of strong year classes on projected discard mortality. As I noted earlier, there were some increases, and everyone is well aware of the consequences of the 2011 year class on discarding in that several years following its arrival. There again, look at additional models for spatial structure and to see whether there are, or if we can discern or estimate some climate drivers on spatial dynamics. And then finally, there's been some recent work, very recent work about diurnal day-night vertical migration and its influence on catchability and surveys. So we may be able to distill some more accurate estimates of abundance, if we can account for differential availability over the course of the day and its influence on our resulting indices of fishery independent abundance. So, and finally, the bottom line here. Next slide, please. This is again the P-star projection, and it because the stock is going down, you'll note that the catch, the OFL, is going down. It goes from 87 to 7,700 metric tons. Because the stock is at a very high level of abundance, and P-star is also at about 0.49. There's not much difference between the ABC and the OFL. This again is expected. When those two values were averaged, it resulted in roughly about 8,000 on either side of 22 and 23. That resulted in a P-star in 2023 that was above 0.5. So one way to think of it is that you're simply, it depends on which way the stock is going, whether you're taking more out in a given year or less. So if the stock is declining, you take less in 2022 and more in 2023 than you should, or that you would have. If the stock was going up, you just have the reverse. You'd have more in 2022 and less in 2023. So if you have to back off for that average, there will be a little bit of loss in terms of the total taken out in those 2 years. But I'm sure this topic will be discussed further at as we proceed forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present that, and thank you, Julia and Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for your comment. So I'm going to go back to Julia. I do have a question, but I'm going to hold off until Julia finishes up her presentation with a staff recommendation. But I'll ask that question once Julia finishes up. Go ahead, Julia.
Thank you. So next I'll cover the monitoring committee recommendations. And this flow chart shows how we take the OFL and ABC that we get from the SSC, and we use it to derive all the other catch and landings limits that we use for this species. And for black sea bass, the commercial recreational allocation that's defined in the FMP is landings based. So it applies to the amount of the ABC that we think is going to be landed. And the way we decide how much is landed versus discarded is not something that's defined in the FMP, and that's something that the monitoring committee recommends every year. And so everything with an asterisk on it is something that the monitoring committee recommends how to get to that step, and the other parts are defined in the FMP. So for how we factor in discards into that flow chart, for black sea bass, it's done a little differently than for the other species, and this is a change that was first implemented for the 2021 specifications, and the monitoring committee is recommending using the same method for the 2022 and 2023 specifications. So it's different from how we did it before 2021, but this recommendation is just basically keeping what we did last year, so no change compared to what we did last year, even though it used to be done differently prior to that. So the way it works is that we start with sector-specific assumptions assuming that dead discards as a proportion of total dead catch in each sector will be equal to the most recent 3-year average proportions. So if we use the data that comes out of the stock assessment for that, so using the most recent 3 years through 2019, that would mean that it would be assumed that in 2022 and 2023, 36% of the total commercial dead catch will come from dead discards in the commercial fishery. And for the recreational fishery, 23% of the total dead catch will come from dead discards in the recreational fishery. The reason the monitoring committee thought it would be good to do it this way for black sea bass is that when they looked at the data over a long time series, they noted that these proportions are relatively stable over time, including across different time periods when there was higher or lower landings limits. This was even the case when looking at years that included the outlier MRIP data. Even these recreational percentages seemed fairly stable over time. And they also recommended it because the data, I'll show this figure again, they looked at figures like this and they noted that the discards, especially in the commercial fishery, but to some extent in both sectors, discards tend to go up and down with landings, you know, based on the history of data so far, especially in recent years, that when landings go up, discards go up. And if landings are going up in response to an increase in the landings limit or a change in management measures, that we don't necessarily see discards turning into landings, that we see them kind of move up and down together. And that is what this method, it helps account for that. And also, the monitoring committee thought it was important to use a method like this because it helps to address this challenge that we had in the past where we had many years in a row of repeated ACL overages due in large part to underestimating discards when we're at this stage in the process. So this is something that, again, was changed last year. We're recommending doing it the same way because for all these reasons here, but again, one of the reasons is it's meant to help better predict discards and help prevent future ACL overages. So the next step in the flowchart is to decide about management uncertainty, to take a reduction or not from the ACL to get to the ACT. And the monitoring committee recommendation for black sea bass for 2022 and 2023 is to have no management uncertainty buffer in either sector. For the commercial fishery, this recommendation was made because, like I previously said, the commercial fishery is generally held very close to the quota. We haven't had any notable commercial overages. The commercial fishery is, in general, very well monitored and controlled. It's largely limited access across the board. It is very well monitored. There's very frequent dealer reporting, for example, and there is in-season closure options to close the fishery down before the end of the year if it appears that they are going to exceed their quota, which hasn't actually happened, but that ability is there. So for all these reasons, the commercial fishery is already pretty well monitored and controlled, and the monitoring committee did not see a need to take a management uncertainty buffer there. The recreational fishery has a lot of differences from the commercial fishery, obviously. It's inherently more difficult to constrain to a certain level and to predict what future harvest and discards will be compared to the commercial fishery. So part of that is because we get our recreational estimates from MRIP, which is a statistical survey. It's not intended to be a census of the entire fishery. This is compared to, for example, the commercial dealer data is intended to accurately capture all commercial landings, but that's not how the recreational estimates are, intended to be. Also, there's open access in the recreational fishery. It's much harder to predict recreational fishing effort. We don't have the same timely level of in-season monitoring. We don't have in-season closure authority for the recreational fishery just due to the data that we use. That would not be practical. Also, I said earlier that there was a 56% RHL overage in 2020, and like I said, that was not unexpected. That was due to a management decision. So it's not like this was something that we were uncertain about or that was a surprise. we expected there to be an overage due to the decision to leave the bag size and season unchanged for the reasons I previously described. And the monitoring committee also, noted that there's the ongoing recreational reform initiative that's going to consider changes to the recreational fishery, consider how we use the data, consider how we set the bag size and season limits. So again, to remind you, that decision to leave the bag size and season limits unchanged that resulted in that 2020 overage, that was meant as a temporary solution. It is the intent of the council and board to consider potentially major changes to how the recreational fishery is managed in the future through the recreational reform initiative. After December of this year, we're hoping to have clarity from the council and board on your intent regarding the commercial and recreational allocations. So that'll factor into future decisions related to catch and landings limits and management uncertainty. So the monitoring committee agreed that at this point in time, they did not recommend a management uncertainty buffer in the recreational sector either. Also, just to point out that, we have these challenges in fisheries management, including in recreational fisheries management, and the monitoring committee didn't think that implementing a management uncertainty buffer would help resolve those current challenges, and that essentially, now would not be the time to implement a management uncertainty buffer that would negatively impact the recreational fishery, and that, there are going to be future considerations related to this after we have better clarity from the council and board on the intent for what would be implemented through the recreational reform initiative and the commercial recreational allocation amendment. So this table shows the catch and landings limits that would be implemented based on all those recommendations that were previously described. So it's showing 2021 for comparison against 2022 and 2023. It's only showing millions of pounds just to reduce the amount of numbers on the screen here. But it's starting with the SSC's recommendations for the varying ABC. And let's see, I highlighted or I emphasized the commercial quotas and the RHLs in bold so you can see how they compare. So you can see that the quotas and RHLs would both increase by 6% going from 2021 into 2022, and then they would decrease by 12% going from 2022 into 2023. The monitoring committee talked about, the idea about the averaged ABC, acknowledging that the SSC wasn't able to recommend averaged ABCs at this point in time. They did recommend that the issues related to the council's ABC control rule and risk policy that limit the ability to use averaged ABCs for very abundant stocks, that should be something that should be looked at in the future, because they think it's beneficial to have at least the option to have averaged ABCs. And due to this issue that was identified related to the averaged approach and the P-star exceeding 0.5, this kind of takes away that option. So the monitoring committee thought that was worth further evaluating in the future. They also noted that the RHLs shown on the screen here are notably lower than the recent MRIP harvest estimates, and this will pose challenges for discussions of recreational management measures for 2022 and 2023 that will occur later this year. And one monitoring committee member emphasized that the council and board should keep this in mind when they're considering final action on the ongoing commercial and recreational allocation amendment. So that summarizes the catch and landings limits for the next 2 years, but the other, there's 2 other topics that you could decide that might warrant changes for 2022, but the monitoring committee is not recommending any changes to them. So one of those topics is the list of commercial management measures shown on the screen here, which can be modified through the specifications process. So I guess in the interest of time, I'm not going to read any of them out loud, but you can see them listed on the screen. Most of these have been in place for many years. The monitoring committee saw no reason to change any of them for next year. Similarly, there's one aspect of the recreational season specifically that if you wanted to change it, you would need to recommend that now as opposed to later in the year. And that relates to the February recreational opening for black sea bass. So this is in regards to like the overall program of if you, for example, don't want to allow this option anymore, if you want the fishery to be closed in February, or if you want to make kind of big picture changes to how that program works, now would be the time as opposed to later in the year, because we need time for the rulemaking process for that. Now is not the time to consider which states are going to participate or how exactly they'll adjust their measures to participate, because those decisions happen through the board closer to February. So at this point in time, you really would only need to decide, do you want to allow this, this February opening to continue or not? The monitoring committee recommends no changes, so that would mean that the fishery would stay open, the recreational fishery would be open for the month of February with the kind of conditions that have been used in the past. So that means that states have to opt into it, and if those that participate, they have to modify their measures later in the year so that participation in the February opening does not increase the annual harvest. Again, states won't decide if they're going to participate or not until closer to February, but so far only North Carolina and Virginia have participated, and North Carolina had previously indicated that they don't intend to continue participating in this program because of challenges that they ran into with relying on MRIP data for estimating their harvest. But Virginia has used their own special monitoring program to monitor this fishery, and the monitoring committee has been very supportive of the Virginia program and noted that it's, this kind of overall program allows flexibilities for states, and with the exception of that North Carolina MRIP challenge, that there hasn't been any major issues related to this program. So the monitoring committee recommends no changes to this program for 2022. So after the monitoring committee meeting, we went back to the AP to give them the opportunity to weigh in again after knowing what the SSC and monitoring committee recommendations were. So this summarizes their input at that point in time. So the advisors considered the stock assessment information that I showed earlier and talked about how the stock assessment shows declining biomass, but still well above the target. One monitoring committee member said that he's seen no signs of a declining biomass off of New Jersey. A few advisors thought that that assumption of what discards will be in future years, the assumption that 36% of commercial dead catch coming from discards, they thought that seemed too high, that 36% value. One advisor said from his own personal experience, targeting black sea bass under a 3,000-pound possession limit in New Jersey, he said that he tends to discard only 5 to 10% of his black sea bass catch. Another advisor said that with the current trawl and pot and trap requirements for minimum mesh size and escape fence, that most black sea bass tend to escape from the gear. So he thought that was the reason why 36% seems too high. Another advisor noted that the recent changes to the state commercial allocations that will come into effect next year, that they may result in fewer dead discards in 2022 and 2023 compared to these estimates, which were based on data from previous years. One advisor said that the council and board should consider recreational hook size requirements to reduce discard mortality in the recreational fishery. One advisor expressed concerns about the ability of trawl surveys to sample structured habitat, which black sea bass like structured habitat, and this advisor had concerns about what that means for the stock assessment. And one advisor said that the council and board should allow harvest of smaller fish, as this would benefit low-income and minority communities. So he said, for example, there's some minority communities that prefer to cook with a whole fish, and a smaller fish is better for that than a bigger fish. Lastly, I added in this slide about ACLs. So this is not something that these tables here are not in the briefing materials, but given the other conversations for other species that happened earlier today, I thought this might help with the conversation for black sea bass. So that's one benefit of going last, is I get to hear what comes up for the other species and adjust as needed. But this summarizes information that goes into the ACL evaluations for both the recreational and the commercial sectors. So for black sea bass, for the recreational fishery, the ACL evaluation is based on a comparison of a 3-year average of dead catch compared to the ACL. And because we don't have dead discards for 2020, the most recent 3-year average is 2017 through 2019. And those are all years when we have to use the old MRF units. So that's what's shown on the screen here for landings and discards. And so a recreational accountability measure is only triggered when the 3-year average of dead catch exceeds the 3-year average of the ACL. And you can see that average was a slight underage of 1.72%. So in fact, an AM was not triggered for black sea bass. You can see that is due to averaging out approximately 14% underage with an 8% and a 1% overage. So that's kind of how it comes into play there. But again, as has been discussed earlier today, if there had been an overage due to stock status, the recreational AM would just be consideration of if changes to the bag size and season limits are needed. It would not be a pound for pound payback. But based on this comparison here, an AM was actually not triggered in the recreational fishery. The commercial side, it's not a 3-year average. It's just a 1-year comparison to the most recent year. But I did put on the 3 years here just so you can kind of compare, I guess. And so this comparison would be based on 2019 only. And you can see that there was a 33% ACL overage based on these numbers, and that there was, some overages in the 2 years before that as well. In all of these years, these overages were due to discards because we did not have a quota overage in these years. And based on recent changes to the accountability measures for the commercial fishery, because stock status is good and these were discards only overages, this actually does not require a payback either. So when the commercial overage is due to discards and not landings, then the accountability measure response is similar to the recreational AM response. So this does not require a payback in the commercial fishery either. And I also wanted to remind you that one of the reasons why the monitoring committee recommended the discard projection methodology that they did is because it attempts to resolve this problem of we did have major ACL overages. We had ACL overages in both sectors for a long time, and the new discard projection methodology is meant to try to fix that, because we had these discards overages because we were under predicting discards at this stage in the game. So hopefully this will be less of a concern moving forward, that we don't expect this trend, especially in the commercial fishery, we don't expect this trend to continue, hopefully moving forward, because we made that change in the discard projection methodology. So thanks for bearing with me for all of that. That's all I had. And just to remind you that the goal for today is to adopt catch and landings limits for 2022 and 2023, and consider if any changes are needed to the commercial management measures shown on the screen here, or that February recreational opening. And to remind you, the monitoring committee recommendation is for no changes to the commercial measures or the February recreational opening. If you do not want to change those, you don't need a motion. And we do have a draft motion ready to go for the if you wanted to approve the monitoring committee's recommendations for the ACLs, ACTs, quota, and RHLs. And that's all I had. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Julia. Let me see if I have any hands for questions. Adam Nowalski. Go ahead, Adam.
Thanks very much. The slide very early in the presentation that showed biomass and recruitment and the retrospective adjustments. I know we keep highlighting the 2011 and 2015 year classes and then talking about recruitment being more average. If I'm interpreting this black square as the retrospective adjusted recruitment value, this would suggest that the 2018 year class was the third highest on record in the time series. Would that be a correct interpretation of what I'm seeing here?
Not necessarily, because only the 2019 estimate is adjusted for the retrospective pattern. And if the other values had been adjusted, they would be a little bit higher too. So I think if you wanted to really compare across years, you would have to compare based on the unadjusted value, because that's the only way that you, I guess we're getting into another situation of like apples to apples comparisons, which I know we all love that metaphor by now, but I think if you wanted to compare across years, you would have to use unadjusted because only the 2019 value here is adjusted.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And it's funny, Adam. This was the one question that I had. I was going to wait till near the end to ask about it, and maybe Julia or Paul can help me understand this. I think it's a little misleading when you see a graph and then you have an adjustment in the terminal year like this. Is there not a way to make that adjustment within, so that red line, as we look at it, so Julia, you're saying that the only adjustment is in the terminal year, so there's no other retrospective adjustment in the previous years. It's just a little bit for the general public. I mean, I understand it because this, it's the business that I've been dealing with, working in for 20 years. But to see a graph and then see an adjustment, I just don't know if there's anything more you can speak to about how that gets adjusted just for that one terminal year, because a terminal year in many cases is the most unpredictable year in an assessment. So I don't know. I thought about that when you were talking earlier. I know Adam just spoke to it. I don't know if there's anything else you can add, or maybe Paul can add something. Just a little misleading. That's all.
Yeah, it definitely causes confusion, and it's a lot more to explain every time we show a figure like this, or even the numbers. But I think I'm not the best person to answer that, and I would defer to somebody like Paul. And I saw Mark Tercero also put something in the chat. So if I would defer to somebody like that to answer that question.
Yeah, it's a little hard to manage all that with the chats and everything. But if Mark or Paul, I'll just open up the floor. If one of you wants to chime in as to how this works, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I can weigh in if you want. I put a couple things in the chat. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
All right. Well, yeah. The reason we do it this way is because we have agreed, as a matter of standard operating procedure, to generally do 7 years of what they call a retrospective peel. In other words, go back and rerun the model 7 times, dropping a year. And so different year classes some year classes might be overestimated, some year classes might be underestimated. Depends on what's causing the retro, and the retro can be caused by numerous things. It can just be noise. It can be different errors in the catch, different errors in the M from what we're putting in the model, things like that. The standing operating procedure is to because really the reason for adjusting it is to get the beginning of the projection correct, given what we've seen recently in the retrospective patterns. So we just adjust the terminal year and use those adjusted values in stating the stock status, and then adjust those stock sizes that the model produces as the starting point for the projections, so that we're up or down, presumably in a more accurate place. So we're starting the projections from a more accurate place than the terminal year estimates, which have what appear to be known retrospective error or bias in it. So that's why we do it that way. And it can be confusing. The other way we do it is sometimes when we have what we call the crucifix plot, which is basically a crosshairs with the model estimate in the middle and the confidence intervals around it. And then the adjusted value inside, we see where the adjusted value falls with respect to those confidence intervals, those 90% confidence intervals that we've used as SOP. And then that's why you'll see some assessments get adjusted and some don't. This one, the adjustment is big enough, so it's outside those bounds. So basically the adjusted values are used to make the stock status determination, and as the underlying stock sizes at individual ages, which you only see the young of the year here. I mean the age 1 here. You don't see age 2, age 3, age 4 up to, I think it's 7 or 8 plus for CBAS. You don't see those here, but all of those get adjusted. And for some stocks, we do it at age. Some stocks we use the SSB overall error and adjust all the ages the same way, since it depends. Differs also between the suite of New England groundfish and what we've sort of settled on as SOP for this suite of Mid-Atlantic demersal stock. So that's the justification for what you're seeing here.
Okay. Yeah, I picked up on about half of what you said, but it's good. I just wanted to ask the question. I
Yep.
know that others are probably thinking the same thing. But thank you, Mark, for your reply to that.
Yeah, so
Let me
basically,
go-
the conclusion is the answer to Adam's question is not necessarily, because as Julia pointed out, you'd have to look at all of the age classes going back in time would go up and down retrospectively, and not all of them
Okay.
go up and not all of them go down. So the rank order might change.
I see.
Suffice
Okay.
it to say, it's not a stinker like 2017 was, so that's good.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's a lot of difference between where I'll speak in general terms, where the red line is and where the red dot is. There's a big difference there.
Right, and part of that is because of the different sizes of the year class. Most of that
I
SSB
see.
is made up of some of those older year classes now. 2011 is now probably well within the plus group, but probably contributes still a very large amount to the SSB, as does 2015. So, and of course,
I see.
so there's
Okay.
that issue too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All righty.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it very much. I don't want to stay on this too long. We've got some more to do here this afternoon. And I do see Dr. Duvall's hand up. Michelle, do you have a question?
Yeah, just really quick, a question and then a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thanks a lot, Julia, for that presentation. Amazing as always. And so just to confirm that management, decision with respect to, recreational measures for 2020. So that's being accounted for in the projections that are being used to set harvest for 2022 and 2023, right?
Yes, sorry, that was not described in this presentation, but yes, that was factored into the ABC projections, because the ABC projections needed to make an assumption about total dead catch in 2020 and 2021. And those assumptions did account for an RHL overage in both years, and that resulted in an assumed ABC overage of about 25% in both years, which is also a change from the way we've previously done things for black sea bass. In the past, it was always assumed that catch would be equal to the ABC in terms of coming up with projections for future ABCs, but given, what those management decisions and the expected overages in the recreational fishery, at least for that period in time, that was factored into the ABC projections as well.
Thanks for that response. And then I also wanted to thank you for the tables that you showed at the end, looking at accountability measures. I had reached out to staff last week, just asking if there was like a handy chart that sort of tracked whether or not there had been any, triggers tripped for accountability measures in the past, recognizing that, those changed for the recreational sector in 2013 and for the commercial sector in 2018, I believe. And, it was all in the, based on some of the comments that advisors made, but just, I think it's part of the conversation that we've been having about management uncertainty. And so I appreciate Julia putting that up. And I know, Julia can speak to this more, but I was thinking that might be information that might be useful for the council as we move forward. There's different pieces and parts of it that are all in places like the fishery information documents, comparisons of harvest and discards to quotas and RHLs and things like that. But Julia, I really appreciate you taking advantage of going last and putting those in there. So thank you.
All right, thanks for those comments, Michelle. Let me go to, I have Emerson Hasbrook. Mike Wayne, I'll come to you once we get to the public. But I'm going to stay with the board and the council at this point. Go ahead, Emerson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Thank you. And Julia, thank you for your presentation. So I had a two-part question. The first part was very similar to the question Michelle just asked. So I just want to make sure I heard the answer correctly. So in 2020, with that large overage of the RHL, we exceeded the ABC by 25%. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. That's just the assumption. I think I have it in a backup slide. So there's kind of a lot going on in this slide, but that's just the assumption that went into the projections because we don't have 2020 discard estimates for the commercial fishery yet. So we don't know what total catch was in 2020 yet, but it was assumed that everything else was right on the money in terms of the discards and landings in the commercial sector. We know there was a landings underage, but based on the challenges that we had with predicting discards, we don't know what discards are yet. But basically, it was just an assumption that had to be made for the projections, and we don't have final overall 2020 catch estimates yet. So basically, what it was assumed that it was assumed that there was only like an overage due to recreational harvest, and it was assumed, again, that everything else was right on the money in terms of landings and discards for the other components of it. I hope that helps. So what this slide is showing is that the assumed catch, like if you look at assumed catch in millions of pounds, it assumes 8.32 pounds total catch compared to an ABC of 15.07 in 2020. And then the slightly different assumption for 2021 due to a different ABC in that year, but it's assuming that recreational harvest in both years is equal to the 2020 estimated recreational harvest, and that's the only adjustment that was made. It's catch equals the ABC plus the recreational harvest only overage, and it's only meant to be an assumption that goes into the ABC projections. And in terms of when we do have to compare, Garfo really is the one that does the official comparison of all these numbers to determine if the ACL was exceeded and what the response is. We're not at that point yet because we don't have the final estimates for 2020 yet. This was, again, just an assumption for the purposes of projecting the ABCs.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And you anticipated the second part of my question in terms of where might we be for 2021. So we might be looking at exceeding the ABC in 2021. So does that trigger any action, or is that what you're waiting for NIMS to determine?
At this point in time, there's not really anything in the process that would trigger an action for us to do in 2021 for 2021. It would be once we get the final 2020 data, that would likely be early next year. Then we consider if a response is needed for the year after that. And then the same thing for 2021. It's always kind of, ideally every year we would look towards the future and say, how are we going to set up the management program to prevent ABC overages? And then when you have final data, you look back on it and say, did we succeed? And if we didn't succeed, what's the appropriate response as defined in the regulations? It's just that we're in a bit of a special situation for these recent years, for 2020 and 2021, where there was that decision to leave the recreational bag size and season limits unchanged. So this is a way different in that we didn't try as hard to prevent recreational overages as we may have in the past. Whether we were successful or not is a bit of a different story. But again, this ABC projection assumption is one way to account for that decision making.
Okay, thank you for your explanation.
All right, thanks for that, Emerson. Let me go to Dewey next. Dewey Hemmelwright, you have a question for Julia or Paul?
Yeah, I have a few, and as the more I listen, the more my mind gets spinning on the outcome of what I'm on a few different things. So can you, Julia, go to page or to slide 19, please?
Yeah, and just so you know, Dewey, you're not the only one whose mind's spinning right now, so it's,
Well,
it's all good.
There's a part of me before I got on this webinar, I left my common sense at home because I don't want it to get stolen or taken from me, because I seems like nowadays I don't have much left. But back to this, management uncertainty, and you laid out a few things in recreational fishery here of the potentials. Is there are we, and particularly to the 2022 specs, are we is there any management uncertainty with achieving the recreational's harvest to their ACL? Because and that's one question, how is that going to happen? It's given the size of the fish getting bigger, it's open access fishery. How is that going to be able to be achieved?
So I guess there's kind of two parts to this process where, this kind of came up earlier today too, like now is the time where you decide, do you want to do you want to take a reduction in the overall catch and landings limits for the recreational fishery to account for management uncertainty? That's what the council and board need to decide today. And then later in the year, there's the decision on what will be the recreational bag size and season limits for next year, based on whatever ACL and RHL you decide on today. So I don't know if that helps get at the question too, but again, the monitoring committee recommendation for right now is no management uncertainty buffer, because the only thing that can do is make the RHL even lower. But it kind of remains to be determined what will be the bag size and season limit for next year, and how the council and board want to handle that in relation to whatever RHL you recommend today. I don't know if that directly answers your question or not.
Well, it kind of does, but I guess there's no other word but management uncertainty. I mean, what was the reasons that the council refresh my memory, why we chose to go with a harvest limit that we knew was going to be exceeded? What was our rationale to do that for 1 year?
So that had a lot to do with the ongoing commercial recreational allocation amendment, not having clarity on what the council and board would do for final action. Like, are you going to keep the same allocations? Or are you going to change them? And if we follow our, typical process and even the way it's spelled out in the regs, like we should be setting bag size and seize limits to prevent ACL overages. But in order to do that, there would have had to have been a major cut in the recreational fishery to constrain them to their RHL and ACL, which are based on the allocations that weren't updated with the new MRIP data. So that's a big part of it. We're kind of still waiting until December of this year for the council and board to decide if those allocations are going to change or not. And then also the idea that there's changes to the recreational fishery being considered through the Recreational Reform Initiative that might change things like how we use the data and how we set the bag size and season limits. And the idea has been that, these are things that hopefully will have clarity on the intent soon, and that will adjust accordingly, and that the intent was not to allow these overages to continue indefinitely, but just to kind of be like a pause on any changes until we get more clarity on those things. That was the initial recommendation that was made in 2019. And then basically the same recommendation was made again in 2020 going into 2021 for all of the same reasons, because we still hadn't completed, the allocation amendment or the Recreational Reform Initiative. And then we had all these COVID data concerns and uncertainties on top of that. So, and it still remains an open question what's going to be done for 2022, because we still have not completed those other actions too. So it was meant to just be kind of a temporary solution, because otherwise we would have needed pretty major cuts in the recreational fishery to prevent them from exceeding their ACL.
One last question, please. The ongoing recreational reform initiative to date, I know there's talked about a harvest control rule and some other measures, and it's my belief that none of them have any addressed any concern, meaning constraining to an ACL. Is that the case, or is there something I'm missing to date?
Yeah, I mean, that'll be more clear tomorrow, because we'll describe the alternatives, preliminary draft alternatives that we've come up with. We'll describe that in more detail first thing tomorrow morning, but short answer is that it kind of depends on the alternatives in the harvest control rule that in general, they all move us away from trying to really constrain very strictly to an RHL or ACL, and some of the alternatives would move us farther away from that than others. And the rationale is that if the fishery is not so strictly constrained to an RHL, that's only allowed in situations where, biomass or stock status is good. So it's kind of adding in a lot of stock status considerations and moving the focus away from a strict MRIP estimate to RHL comparison. So, but I guess the short answer is it depends on the alternative, and all the alternatives would, like I said, move us farther away from that ACL comparison, but some of them move it farther away than others, and it's based on stock status considerations, and we'll describe it in more detail tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dewey. Thanks, Julia, for those answers. I'd like to get to motions at this point. It's 4:45. I'd like to try to wrap things up by around 5 o'clock to keep on schedule as close as we can. So let me go. I'm going to go ahead and call on Tom Foti for a comment or question, and then I'm going to look. Julia, if you can bring up the motion that you prepared, that'll be something that I'll ask for next. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into a long discussion of what's going on, but again, one of the factors is we underestimated the recreational catch for many years, and we did it during the periods of time we set up the quota. And how do we adjust for that? So you basically, when you did those numbers and you gave us smaller quotas than we should have had, you basically set up us up for failure all these years because you put regulations on these little quotas that it should have been larger. And that's what the reallocation should be looking at. What is the numbers actually should be based on historical data? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tom. I don't think you're alone in your thoughts on how the quotas could be different. But at this point, what I'd like to do, and Mike Wayne, Mike, did you have a question on the presentation, or did you want to comment on where we're going with the motion at this point?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mine was a question for Julia. So if you go to
Okay.
I'm going to just
Yeah,
lower.
go ahead and ask your question, Mike. That's fine.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Chairman, Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Julia, can you pull up the slide, catch versus ACLs? I believe it was slide 24, the slide right before the discussion slide. And I'm just trying to reconcile the commercial table. So I'm looking at your flow chart, and the flow chart from the staff memo and the briefing materials is telling me that the commercial ACL is landings plus dead discards. But I'm struggling to match that up with what you have in the table. So maybe I've just confused myself, and you can get me straight on this.
So this is showing the actual landings and the actual dead discards, and the flow chart includes basically the expected landings and expected discards. So the numbers would be different. So the ACL is basically the commercial quota plus the expected dead discards. This is showing like what actually happened for landings and discards compared to the ACL in that year. It doesn't show the quotas or the RHLs or the expected discards on the tables here.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So I guess I'm just kind of struggling to understand like what the requirement is here. Is it to constrain the fishery to the ACL or not? And the table is suggesting that the total catch exceeded the ACL in those 3 years. And I guess I'm just struggling. I see that's because the discards have been forgiven, I guess, but I'm kind of struggling how this relates to how we do accounting on the back end. Maybe you can help me with that.
Yeah, I think I can respond to that. So what's shown on the screen here is what we use like after the fact to look at it. I guess like to start with, the regulations have a lot to say about we should try to prevent ACL overages. And so this on the screen here is an example of the numbers that we look at when we say, okay, did we succeed in doing that? And then if we didn't, then what's the appropriate response? And, based on the way the evaluation is done for both sectors, we did not exceed the average ACL for the recreational sector, but we did exceed the ACL for the commercial sector. Like you said, that overage was only based on discards because we didn't have a commercial quota overage. And the regulations for this species says that when the overage is due to discards only in the commercial sector, you don't have a pound for pound payback if stock status is good, which it is. But I also want to remind everybody that we did change the way that we project the discards starting in 2021. So now we're actually predicting higher discards than we used to based on the method that was in place in the years that are shown on the screen here. So that's another example of, you know, we're not just looking at this and saying like, oh, we have these major ACL overages and that's fine, because we're hoping that the way that we now predict discards, we're hoping that that will prevent us from having the same degree of overages. And that factors into our how we calculate next year's catch and landings limits. And then after we get final data on those future years, then we'll look back again and say, did we succeed in preventing ACL overages? And then if we didn't, then determine what the response should be.
All right, thanks, Julia. Mike, did you have any, you still have your hand up. Did you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to process all of this. There's clearly been a lot of attention given to the recreational overages, but I mean, this table tells a different story, at least from 2017 through 2019. Thanks.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that comment. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to stay with public comment at this point. Tom Foti, I see your hand up, but I'm going to go to Greg DiDomenico first. And then, Tom, if you have, I just saw your hand go down. Go ahead, Greg.
This issue of these overages were carefully and explained very well by Julia. I brought this up during the monitoring committee meeting because these overages were essentially forgiven by Framework 13, which was done by the council and supported by the agency, because prior to the MRIP numbers and the operational assessment adding 50 or 60% to the OFL and black sea bass, we were unable to make the quota changes that were necessary. And it was widely, I guess, understood that these overages were were due to the low quotas that we could not budge for a very long time on black sea bass. So I don't know what's going to happen going forward, 2020, 2021. But I think Julie explained that we should not see these high overages or these high bycatch discard overages. But again, to be clear, that this was the very reason for the framework that forgave overages, and that was because quotas were set too low for a period of time, and that was the result of which was that we all threw away a lot of unnecessarily discarded fish. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, Greg. I appreciate that. Okay, so we've had a good back and forth with staff and the presentation. And so what I'd like to do at this point is to focus our attention on the task at hand, which is to set the specs for 2022 and 2023. Staff have put together a motion, which I'd like to ask if anyone from the board or the council would like to make at this point. Is there any interest in making this motion from anyone from the board or the council? I see Joe Cimino's hand up, which, Joe, I guess you could make it for both the board and the council, and you have a little bit of reading to do and lots of numbers. So if you're good with that, go for it.
Thank you. I'll give it a shot. Move to adopt the following specifications. That's a bad start already.
Yeah, you didn't start out real good. So yeah, maybe you could just take a deep breath and start over again.
Yeah, okay. Move to adopt the following specifications for black sea bass. For 2022, the recreational ACL equal to ACT equal to 8.76 million pounds, resulting in an RHL of 6.74 million pounds. The commercial ACL equal to ACT at equal to 10.1 million pounds, resulting in a commercial quota of 6.47 million pounds. For 2023, the recreational ACL equal to ACT equal to 7.74 million pounds, resulting in an RHL of 5.95 million pounds. The commercial ACL equal to ACT equal to 8.93 million pounds, resulting in a commercial quota of 5.71 million pounds.
All right, thanks, Joe. Appreciate you making that motion. Let's go ahead and see. Let's see if we have a second on behalf of the board. I see Shanna Madsen. Shanna, are you making that motion on behalf of the board?
I am, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to not have to read it out loud.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You won't have to read anything. We'll leave that up to Joe. All right, let's go to the council and make this official. Anyone on the council want to make that motion that Joe just read to us? Kate Wilkie. Okay.
Seconding the motion, yes.
All right, thanks, Kate. I appreciate that. You know, it's been discussed. There's been questions asked and answered, and so I don't want to take too long on this. But is there any discussion on the motion? I'll ask for both board and council members. Is any discussion? Okay, seeing no hands, is there anyone from the public? Any public comment on the motion before we call the question? All right, I don't see any hands from the public. I think Chairman Nawalski, I think we took the first vote last time. So I'm going to turn to you for the vote on behalf of the board. And then we'll go to the council.
Thank you very much. And this motion has been read into the record. Is there any need for a caucus? I am not seeing any hands, nor am I hearing anything. So we'll go ahead with the question. Is there any objection to the motion? Again, I see no hands nor verbal objection. Are there any abstentions? There are no abstentions. The motion passes the board without objection nor abstention. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Adam. I'm going to ask the same question of the council. Are there any objections to the motion by members of the council? Okay, seeing none, are there any abstentions from members of the council? Okay, also seeing none, the motion passes with no objection and no abstentions. Thank you for that. It was a good discussion, lots of good questions, and I appreciate everyone's time on that one. So, Adam, you mentioned earlier that there's no need for an FMP review for black sea bass at this point.
Well, there is a need for an FMP review, but it is my understanding from staff that it will be conducted via email, and we do not have to take it up during this meeting today.
Yeah, I didn't mean that there was no reason. Yeah, that's what I meant. We don't have to do it today. Is there any other business to come before the council and the Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Board at this time? I'll just ask the staff if there's anything. Is there anything else that we need to take up before we adjourn today? Julia,
Sorry, struggling with the mute button.
or,
Nope,
or
nothing else
commission
to
staff?
read on our end.
Everything's good? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and, so I'm gonna just do a quick overview of where we're gonna be for tomorrow. So I'm gonna actually adjourn this meeting, as a joint meeting with the Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Board. We're gonna meet tomorrow morning with, ASMFC's, policy board, to discuss the harvest control rule framework and addendum, meeting 1, and then we're going to come back, Adam, for Summer Flounder Scup Black Sea Bass at 11 o'clock. So, I appreciate everyone's involvement in today's meeting, and we'll go ahead and recess, or we'll adjourn this meeting now, and we'll bring it back to order with the Summer Flounder Scup Black Sea Bass Board tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Hopefully, we'll try to stay on track the best we can. Thanks everyone for all of your time and effort today, and your great comments, and thanks to Paul and to commission and council staff. We're going to go ahead and close things out for today. Enjoy your evening, and we'll be back in touch tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.